When you're standing in a warehouse, on a roof, or out in the field and trying to decide whether a thermal imager is worth the money, it can feel like a gamble. You worry about spending a lot on a device that might be too complicated, or that the images won't be clear enough to actually solve the problem you have. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon, and I'm going to walk through exactly what you'll see when you actually use the Testo 868s, where it shines, and where it might leave you wanting something else. First off, the biggest hesitation people have with a thermal camera is the learning curve. The software can be intimidating, the menus feel endless, and you're often left wondering if you'll ever be able to interpret the colors correctly. I spent a few afternoons with the 868s, pairing it with the companion app on my phone, and the experience was surprisingly straightforward. The app launches straight into a live view, and the first thing you notice is the automatic hotspot and cold spot detection. Instead of hunting through palettes, the device flags the hottest and coldest pixels with a simple overlay. For someone who just wants to point, shoot, and get a quick answer like checking an electrical panel for overheating or finding a water leak behind a wall, that feature alone saves minutes of manual analysis. Now, let's talk about image quality in a practical sense. The thermal sensor is 160,120 pixels, which on paper sounds modest compared to high-end research units, but the NETD, noise equivalent temperature difference, is under 0.08 C. In plain English, that means the camera can distinguish temperature differences that are barely perceptible to the human eye. When I walked around a HVAC system with the unit, the thermal picture clearly separated a pipe that was running at 68 C from one that was only at 64 C. In a real-world inspection, that level of granularity lets you pinpoint the exact component that's starting to fail before it trips a breaker or causes a costly shutdown. The integrated 5MP visual camera is another practical win. Many thermal imagers force you to switch between a separate visual module or rely on a low-resolution grayscale overlay. With the 868s, you get a full-color photo that aligns perfectly with the thermal data, and you can annotate it directly in the app. I used it for a home inspection job, snapping a picture of a roof vent while the thermal overlay showed a cold spot that indicated a potential insulation breach. The final report combined both images into a single, easy-to-read PDF that I could hand to the homeowner. That on-site analysis capability is the kind of thing that turns a piece of equipment from a novelty into a workflow tool. Battery confidence is often a silent deal-breaker for field work. The 868s runs on a rechargeable lithium-ion pack that the manufacturer rates for about 5 hours of continuous use. In practice, after a full charge I was able to complete 3 separate site visits, each lasting roughly an hour and a half without needing to recharge. The battery indicator sits right on the screen, so you never get caught off guard. If you're a professional who needs to be on call all day, you'll probably want to carry a spare pack. But for the typical day-long inspection or hobbyist outing, the stock battery feels sufficient. Ease of focus is another spot where the 868s distinguishes itself. Some thermal cameras require you to manually adjust focus, and that can be a nightmare when you're trying to capture a quick read on a moving piece of equipment. The 868s uses an autofocus system that locks onto the thermal target in less than a second. I tested it on a running motor and on a stationary pipe. In both cases the image stayed sharp as I moved the camera a few centimeters closer or farther away. That confidence in focus means you can keep your eye on the job rather than fiddling with the device. Low light performance is something you might not think about with a thermal camera, but the visual side matters when you need contextual photos. The 5MP camera handles dim environments surprisingly well thanks to a fairly large sensor and built-in HDR processing. In a dimly lit attic, the visual image was still clear enough to see wiring and insulation, and the thermal overlay remained accurate. If you plan to use the device purely for nighttime inspections where only the thermal data matters, you'll be fine. But if you want clear visual documentation in low light, you might still need a flash or a separate lighting source. Stabilization is a subtle but practical factor. The 868s does not have mechanical image stabilization, but the software does a decent job of smoothing out minor hand shake. When I held it by hand and walked slowly, the thermal image didn't jitter to the point of becoming unreadable. However, if you try to capture a steady shot from a moving vehicle, you'll notice a bit of blur in the visual overlay. For most indoor or slow-moving outdoor work, this isn't a showstopper, but it's worth noting if you're planning high-speed inspections. One area where